We've been looking at using HTML functions written in JavaScript to add functionality to our HTML pages. And now we're going to look at adding parameters to those functions. To recap, we had a function in our convert to meters for our swimming time converter. And we just defined a function as we usually do in JavaScript, except that it's inside the script tags. And this particular function has no parameters, as we can see, because of the opening and closing of braces. And we just pulled the values straight from the page using our DOM objects. Recall that this script will define the function, define the code that will be executed when the function is called, but the function is not being called in the script. To call the function, we linked the function call to the onClick of the button. So for the onClick attribute, we have the name of the function with the parentheses indicating that there's no parameters. And so when we click that button, then the code defined for the function is executed, getting the current yard time and setting the meter time. Let's take a look at a new function. Here I have an HTML page where I want to calculate the dive score. The dive score is calculated by entering 3 judges' scores. You add those scores together, multiply it by the degree of difficulty, and that gives us the dive score. So here in our script, I've defined a function called calculate dive score, and that pulls those values off the page. Dive 1 difficulty is the ID of this input box that's in the table, so we can pull that value, store it into our difficulty variable. In this case, I'm explicitly converting it to a number to make sure that I'm getting number values. And the same thing for each of the judges' scores, 1, 2, 3, pulling out the 3 judges' scores. Then I can do the calculation, and then I can store that total score back into the page by setting the dive 1 total score value, which is the ID of this box. So the function is defined in the script, and then that function is called every time we click the button. The onClick calls calculate dive score, which then executes this function. This is a new example, but it's the same as we have been doing. It's a function defined, pulling the data from the page, and calling that function by clicking a button. We can enhance this function by adding parameters to the function. So we can pass in our DOM objects here. These are the IDs. And so when we are in the function, we use the IDs that we pass in. So dive 1 total score becomes nickname total score ID. So everywhere we see total score ID, here it is right here, it's going to use that DOM object dive 1 total score. And so at the end, it's going to set our calculated value to the total score ID on the page. Same thing with difficulty ID. We're going to be pulling dive 1 difficulty and nicknaming it difficulty ID. And every time we see difficulty ID, it's going to be pulling the dive 1. Notice how the parameters are just the same. They go by order. So the first one passed in is identified with the first nickname. The second one passed in is identified with the second nickname, and so forth. I do have an HTML page with this code in it, and that is available in the zip file if you'd like to try it out yourself. It builds out the table with 1 row, and we have the button, and we can see that we're passing in the parameters which match the IDs on the HTML page. And we can go ahead and execute it. If I put in some judges' scores, let's see, they got a 4.5. That's a pretty average score. And we can click to calculate that dive score, and now we have successfully calculated that score. But having parameters hasn't done very much for us in this case because we're just taking one set of IDs and calling it once. The value in adding parameters is when you want to reuse that function and you want to pass in different values for those parameters. A diver doesn't actually just dive one dive, they dive a set of 6 dives for a dual meet. Our dive calculator needs to be able to handle all 6 dives. And with 6 dives, that means we're calculating that dive score in the same manner to fill in each one of these dive scores in the right column. So how can we reuse our code and take advantage of that in our function? Well, because we have parameters, our calculate dive score could pass in the dive 1 score like we did originally, but it also could pass in the IDs for the dive 2 scores. If you look at our HTML, you can see I've set it up with logical names. So row 1 has all the dive 1 information, row 2 has all the dive 2, and I've named those IDs so they correlate to the dive number. This still hasn't really gotten us exactly where we want to be. We could use the same function to calculate each dive score, but right now we're putting that on the button. So we'd need a button for every single row to calculate the dive score. What I really want is one single button that will calculate all the dive scores and sum it up to get a grand total. The part that's being reused is the part that calculates each individual score. So let's look at how we can solve that problem. We want to be able to calculate each dive score just like we did before, but we can't hook that function call to the button because that will only calculate one dive score. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new function. I'm going to name that calculate all dive scores, and this is the function we're going to hook to the button. So when I click that button, it's going to call this second function that I have defined in my script. This function then calls our first function. It will calculate the dive score for dive 1 and pass in all those IDs that have been turned into DOM objects by the browser so that we can set the total score for the first row, set the total score for the second row on the second call, and so forth. So we want to make that call for each dive. By putting that in this function, calculate all dive scores, we can call one function with the button, which will then call calculate dive score 6 times by the time we get all the calls in. Right now, of course, it's just calling it 2 times, one for dive 1 and one for dive 2. With these changes and adding a calculate call for each of the rows here, we are almost to our solution that will fill in the dive score in all the different rows, but we also want a grand total score, and that's a sum of all the dive scores together. Since we're writing the total score for each row right into the HTML page, we could just pull them off the HTML page and sum them up and then put that in the grand total. But we already have those numbers in JavaScript, so why not just use those? If we just add one line to our calculate dive score function, return total score, that will take that score that we calculated and return it back to the caller of the function. Where are we calling that function calculate dive score? Well, we're calling that in our overall function that's hooked to the button. Here we're calling calculate dive score, and because we added that return line, it's going to return that score for dive 1, and I've just created a variable to store that score. If I do that for every single dive, then I will have each of the dive scores that I can then sum up. The HTML page has an input box for the grand total score, so all we need to do is get that ID, and then we can use the DOM object to set that grand total score at the end. Adding these finishing touches will be left to you as an assignment.